Hey there. So, I've been looking forward to doing more like this for quite some time now, and I finally have a reasonably well put together visual presentation that I get to share. So, this one's called Metafiction, A Cure for Truth. And this will be a very, very, very extremely brief introduction because I'd like to get this in under 20 minutes or so, and it's going to go from the time of Moses up to the time of Rick and Morty. And I'll start with a brief introduction to how I think the religious scriptures, for instance, were constituted a different type of fiction than what is popular in modern television today. And then we'll end with an in-depth analysis of my favorite Rick and Morty episode, which is Vindicators 3. So we'll look at that in detail too. So, in a reversal of typical journalistic proceeds, I'm going to give the bibliography first, and that's going to involve the following texts here, and then some others if I think of any that I need to add later. John Gardner's The Art of Fiction is a discussion of literary theory for fiction writers, and I would really suggest it for anyone, though, who's just interested in literature, even if you're not a fiction writer. There are essays in there about the essential theory of fiction writing and its history that contributed immensely to my own understanding of genre. And David Foster Wallace is going to come up too, especially since we're going to be discussing metafiction, and Wallace himself was deeply, deeply fascinated with postmodernism, certainly, and he was one of its foremost critics. Darwin's Origin of Species is going to come up since it had a lot to do with the downfall of Christianity in the West, I would say, and also Nietzsche's Will to Power, since Nietzsche announced the death of God. We'll also look at Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, since Campbell, I would say, contributed to a 20th century revival of mythology, which the 1970s postmodernists and the metafictionists that came after them have been working exactly against that myth. And so that means we'll also be seeing the postmodern theorists like Foucault and Derrida, and we'll look at a postmodern artist named Magritte. And we'll also see a lot of influence from Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, the lectures as well as the book, since I've exposed myself to both, and especially my understanding of Nietzsche and the Soviet Union is influenced by Peterson quite heavily. So, having acknowledged my intellectual debts, we will begin. So, I want to begin by talking about Moses. I think it's worth considering as just contributing to an understanding of how narrative used to function in old times. It's really worth considering that the ways that people got values for how they should live was often from religious scriptures, right? Like I think people genuinely and generally believed in a truth. There was a way to live which was true and good. That's why they had the Ten Commandments. And there was a deeply held confidence in the early days of Christianity and Judaism that there was one true God and there was one true way to live that would bring happiness, or even if not happiness, it would at least make the suffering of life bearable. The Christians and the Jews figured that out a long, long, long time ago, and I think that one reason that people find themselves so existentially confused now is because we've lost touch with a lot of that ancient wisdom. Not necessarily because we don't believe in God anymore, because I don't consider myself formally religious, but what I do, actually what Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures have instilled in me is a deep respect for the Bible as a work of literature and absolute treasure trove of ancient wisdom. And that's really worth considering. And so I think people used to look at art like this, or stories that had these religious themes, and I think they were inspired by this kind of thing. Jesus' example, which was pick up your suffering and bear it. and that seemed to work. That seemed to work for people. But when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, I think people were thrown into a considerable amount of doubt about their position in the universe. Darwin supposed that humanity had not been created directly by God, but rather that humanity had evolved from some other primordial being, and therefore it wasn't so obvious that humanity was God's favorite species, and we weren't so sure whether we were special anymore. That was quite upsetting. So shortly after that, Nietzsche announced the death of God, and he proposed that this would trigger the greatest new phase of history, and we wouldn't really know how things would go after this. That's a terribly vague way to put it, but I have another Nietzsche slide, and I'll get into a bit more detail. Essentially, he was, I would say, one of the first modernists, and that could definitely be contested, but I think essentially his theory that humans would have to make up their own morality, become the overman, the uberman, the superman. They would have to make up their own morality because of the moral void left by Christianity. That seems like the kind of grand utopian idealism that we associate with modernists. Although it's worth considering that despite the way that atheists celebrate the death of God and the way that evangelists attack Nietzsche for this, in reality he wasn't celebrating. As this excerpt from The Gay Science demonstrates, Nietzsche was not celebrating here. Nietzsche considers us murderers. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? And who will wipe this blood off of us? So far from this being a celebratory statement for Nietzsche, the death of God was a great crime, and there would never be enough water to wash away the blood. And that's because, as David Foster Wallace pointed out, in reality there's no such thing as atheism. People can't just lose their God. And since I'm young and since I spend so much time reading, I don't think I have a lot of terribly original ideas, but well, let me submit something to you right now that I think is pretty decent, and it's that, well, one way to put this is God doesn't die. I think God evolves. That's what Wallace is getting at, and it's what Nietzsche was afraid of. And that turned out to be exactly right. Jonathan Haidt has also agreed on this point, that religion is the default setting of human beings, much more than science, per se. So, and that's worth considering in light of the Soviet Union, for instance, when God died, for instance, Stalin became God, Lenin became God. And yet, as John Gardner has pointed out, the effect on the reader of an idea is great indeed, but it's not necessarily healthy. And I think this loss of religious faith, maybe, or the moral value of that faith, is one of the greatest losses of the 19th century. And Nietzsche, I think, was quite correct in claiming that that would be a tragedy for human beings. The lack of morality, the nihilism. And so, furthermore, though, John Gardner pointed out that the unjustified notions of human certainty also had a lot to do with the suffering of the 20th century. The Nazis, for instance, quite liked Nietzsche's idea that humans could make up their own morality. That seems like a convenient justification for, well, stuff like that. The Superman makes up his own laws to bring in the great Germany ruled by the Aryan race, for instance. But that certainty didn't quite work out. Not for German POWs. These poor guys are going to the Gulag. Not for the peasants or their horses or their families. Definitely not for the Ukrainians. Not so much. So these unjustified notions of human certainty, the grand narratives of Marxism and Nazism that were supposed to usher in the utopia. Meanwhile, this was happening in America. It's really worth considering why. Well, Foucault, who ironically was a Marxist, I actually think gets this right here. It is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, or knowledge. How could one think anything else after the 20th century? It might even be the logical reaction. We were so sure about these truths that, as Nietzsche suggested, we could define our own values and that would lead us into prosperity. We could establish the workers' utopia. That would lead us into prosperity. But not so much. So, despite what a vicious critic Jordan Peterson is of the postmodernists, I think that their horrid cynicism is actually quite understandable. And to be honest, it escapes me why, it does escape me why they continued to be Marxists after seeing what happened there, but maybe that's just one instance of how genuinely reprehensible a group of intellectuals they were, and in that case, Peterson could definitely be right there. But, well, point is, I think Foucault certainly had plenty of reasons for suggesting such cynicism after seeing what happened in the 20th century, and then long before Foucault, there was Magritte in the 1930s, was making art like this, which I think this reasonably captures the fundamental postmodern objection to, I would say, the modernist sham, which is that grand narrative does not constitute truth. Art doesn't reflect truth. Art just reflects art. That's what the 20th century demonstrated. These narratives misled us. We thought we could follow Marx's scientific utopia that was conceived by a great, reasonable mind. Well, that turned out to not be so reasonable. And so there's plenty of reason to be seeking ways. And we're finally at metafiction here. After the horrors of the 20th century, there was plenty of reason to be suspicious of narrative itself. There was plenty of reason to be suspicious that art was actually harmful. And what the metafictionists did was seize on methods for exposing the inner workings of art such that the reader knows what is happening to them as they read, so that they are less likely to be deceived or misled by art that is unwisely created, or an idea that just happens to be earnestly put forward but murderously misleading. But some modern films, such as the Avengers and all the superhero movies, maintain the triumphant attitude towards godlike figures. There's a genuine confidence in higher powers. I pulled a couple quotes from the Avengers trailer from 2012. When we needed them, they could fight the battles that we never could. And if we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn sure we'll avenge it. There's a punk rockish song playing during a trailer too that says something like, "Nothing can stop us now." So in general, I would say these are the more traditional hero narratives have a positive attitude about the truth of the narrative itself, and they're confident that it's good, and they go forward with it without being self-critical. But that's not at all the case with the modern metafictionists, who are weary of fiction's very ability to reflect truth. Again, as Magritte said, art doesn't reflect truth. Maybe art just reflects itself, like this man's reflection, flipped reflection, or this illustration of a pipe, which says in French below, "This is not a pipe." And Magritte said, "Well, I can't put tobacco in it, therefore it's not a pipe." And so that's a classic postmodern trope, is don't confuse the art with the real thing. Don't assume that art or an idea on paper actually represents the real thing, or can even represent it in a fair way that you could expect would lead you to some kind of truth. So we're finally going to start with Rick and Morty. So in the beginning of the episode Vindicators 3, it's episode 4 of season 3. That's right. So Morty's pretty excited because the Vindibeacon on the shelf there has just started flashing, and they're being called to assemble by the Vindicators, and Morty's going off about how the Vindicators are the first line of defense and justice, and they're the guardians of the unguarded, and in general he's captivated by idealizations of heroes rooted in the traditional hero narrative. And meanwhile, based on Rick's expression here, you can tell that he's not quite so captivated. And so this next slide is just brilliant, how the facial expressions, the animators really get these perfect. And so Rick actually mocks what Morty is captivated by. He says straight out, "I refuse to answer a literal call to adventure, Morty." Rick doesn't even want to go on this hero adventure. And I think most of all, it's worth noting the line, "I refuse to answer a literal call to adventure," because here, well, you know that Dan Harmon, who writes this, is quite educated about his literature and his mythology, and he knows who Joseph Campbell is. When Joseph Campbell wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces, he proposed several reoccurring themes that were in all hero stories, and one of those, the critical event, is the call to adventure. So that's when the hero exists in some ordinary known world, and something calls them to go forthrightly into the unknown to discover things, learn things, be taken apart, fight a terrible monster, put themselves back together, and then go home and tell their culture what they learned. That's how cultures grow. But Rick doesn't quite like that idea. He's suspicious of it for one reason or other which isn't quite clear to us until later in the episode, and we'll see that. So this self-referentiation, Rick's own knowledge that he is a character, serves as a reminder to the audience that this is just a story. That's what that's for. It's supposed to deliberately break the continuous fictional dream that characterizes more standard traditional narratives, such as typical superhero movies. They really try to put you in another world, and they just let you exist in that. But metafiction narratives like Rick and Morty and other postmodernist television shows will deliberately pull you out of the narrative in order to deliberately remind you that this is just a story. And that's, I think, is a key method for reminding readers that this is just a story, and don't take it too seriously. Don't take any truth from this, because truth might not be real. We don't know. And so, okay, so finally they get on the ship with the Avengers, and these are four of the Avengers, and that's, oh, excuse me, I call them the Avengers. These are the Vindicators, and I would say, a characterization of the Avengers. It's a caricature, that's the word I'm looking for. So it's a caricature of the Avengers, and we will see how Rick will push their buttons and force them to show their true colors, that in reality they're not really superheroes, and superheroes aren't real. And that's the point that Rick is going to spend the entire episode making, is that there's really no such thing as heroes or villains. And you should decide for yourself whether you think that's true. So here Rick is making some jokes at Rick is laughing here because he's made some jokes about the Vindicators. He's laughing at Alan Rails here about his parents' death in a railroad accident, and he calls this is Million Ants right here. He calls Million Ants Wiggly Turd Man, and all kinds of sick jokes, and Morty looks pretty uncomfortable. Rick's happy with himself, and this other Vindicator in training back here with the broom, that's Noob, and Noob is saying, God damn, at Rick's jokes, and so Rick appreciates that greatly, as we'll see later on. Later on, though, it's clear that Morty is embarrassed that the Vindicators don't seem to like them, despite having called them back for Vindicators 3. And yeah, if you know the seasons of Rick and Morty, Vindicators 2 was never made because, well, as the story goes, the Vindicators made Vindicators 2 without Rick and Morty, which further breaks the fictional dream, right? That the Vindicators can be doing episodes that we don't see. So for Morty, then, goodness is a matter of virtue. And it bothers him that a group of heroes that he looks up to don't actually like them. But Rick views this a little differently. Rick is actually excited to learn that the Vindicators didn't want to bring them back because it demonstrates, well, just how powerful Rick is. It further establishes his position as the smartest man in the universe and the dominant being and general badass in the universe. As was evidenced by, just in the last episode, him turning himself into a pickle and then fighting Russian spies in sewers and just generally being a badass. And Rick quite likes that about himself. Actually, it might be the only thing about himself that he likes. And so Rick isn't really bothered by their disapproval because they're bringing him back. Just makes him feel powerful, which is maybe one of the only things he cares about. In fact, Jordan Peterson points out consistently that what all postmodernists really care about is power. Because think about it, if you don't have values, if there's no values, then there's no hierarchies. What do you base your hierarchies on? Like, if Rick is more powerful than Morty, which he obviously is, Rick seems to decide most of the adventures, well, what's the difference between Rick and Morty? If it's not good, if it's not a matter of good and evil, it's got to be just power. And that's exactly what Rick celebrates. He celebrates his own power. And his direct quote here is, I guess there's no accounting for taste. And that's really worth thinking about. Taste. The only thing that differentiates heroes from villains is taste. And we'll see that a bit more later. So Rick's going off to get a drink, and we know they disagree about heroes, and in a deeper way, we know the root of Rick's cynicism. He considers heroism to be entirely relative, which is why he doesn't respect the Vindicators. And so speaking of taste, I thought it would be a good time to look at Andy Warhol right now. Excuse me for breaking the narrative here, but, well, that's what metafictionists do anyway. It's worth considering whether, for instance, this constitutes art. This is Andy Warhol's Campbell's Soup gallery. And I think this art illustrates a similar point to what Rick is trying to get at. If everything is relative, who's to say that commodity isn't art? Who's to say that commodity isn't art? And art isn't just a commodity. It's just taste. And so Rick has a long night. And Morty looks quite disappointed there. And the Vindicators are reasonably upset. And the next thing to know, though, is that this is Noob again. And he's responsible for cleaning up Rick's diarrhea pretty soon. And he says, God damn. But it's in a much different context and tone than when he says it in the first case, which is when he's laughing at Rick's jokes. And this actually illustrates another key postmodern trope, which is that the same phrase can have entirely different meaning depending on its context. And that's one way of mitigating those harmful effects of fiction, which is realizing the fact that if meaning depends entirely on context, then there is no one true meaning. They dodge the danger of objective truth by never accepting anything as definitely true. It's a decent strategy, but Jordan Peterson and others have pointed out that it just leads to nihilism. So it's really worth considering what you think about that. And for instance, here's another character who's quickly going to get satirized. This is Maximus Renegade Star Soldier, and he's really trying to take Morty under his wing in one way or another by giving him this jacket. And we'll see how sincere he is later. So he's talking to Morty about good and evil. Actually, this is I would say, the most deliberate setup of the discussion about good and evil so far. Maximus takes Morty aside and he says, if you want to be a vindicator, all it takes to be a superhero is to know the difference between good and evil and root for good. That's what he's saying here. And then Morty quickly replies, well, Rick says that good and evil are just artificial constructs. And that's really worth considering too, because as we see Rick and Morty now going into the lair to fight Worldender, Rick mocks the seriousness of the whole investigation, further disrespecting these characters' role as being genuinely superheroes. And so quickly they get locked in by some mysterious force, and they see that they get there and Worldender is already dead. So this is Million Ants here, and he's saying, in this frame, I sense the presence of a greater evil. And so what the show means to suggest right here is that if there's one thing that is definitively evil, that even postmodernists should admit is definitively evil, it's Rick. Specifically drunk Rick, but we'll see. And so Rick has essentially set up a game show here where the other Vindicators are being sawed and they need to connect their gimmicks with each of them. And Morty, of course, realizes that it's a bit, and all of the identifiers apply to all of them. And so what the writers here are doing is, and what the scriptwriters are doing through drunk Rick is making a critique of what the hell is going on when superhero movies are constructed. And this is what's going on. There's several key tropes that are being constantly repeated. I think the tragic origin one is quite funny, and quite true. And this pokes a hole in the truth of the whole hero narrative when you realize that a lot of them are built from the same building blocks. Those narratives seem a lot more deliberately constructed and less true and less sincere. So in this way, again, Rick and Morty, as a work of metafiction, is poking holes in narrative itself to expose, I would say, the inner workings of story itself as it tells a story. It's educating the viewer on just exactly how story works. And again, I think largely the motivation for that is a will to educate the viewer on techniques of fiction so that they aren't so susceptible to being misled by carelessly considered ideas. And well, here's one carelessly considered idea. So Maximus Renegade Star Soldier essentially starts flipping out about being trapped, and then there's a pretty considerable blood show when he tries to escape the arena, and drunk Rick has set up some pretty brutal booby traps that don't just kill Maximus Renegade Star Soldier, but really butcher him brutally. There's a good 10 seconds where you're just listening to chainsaws and shit chopping up his body. It's pretty brutal, and it illustrates what a ruthless and genuinely evil person Rick can be. I mean, even sober Rick looks pretty horrified at what he's accomplished. So he should really be considering that. And so here's Morty explaining Rick's bit and how he's pointed out the fallacies of their gimmicks. Rick's point here is that, as Morty says, well, Rick's point here is that none of you are very special or different. That's always his point. And so Morty is already beginning to get a grip on what the postmodern objection is here, because by the time they get to the next phase, Rick's traps have already resulted in the death of one more Vindicator, and it's not before long they're starting to fight amongst themselves, and Rick already looks pretty happy about this. On the TV screen, for instance, he challenges the Vindicators to name the place they'll never talk about, since, and this is pretty significant, to fight evil is to fight yourself, and that's an essential, I would say, with an essential criticism. To fight evil is to fight yourself, and so what Rick is pointing out about the Vindicators is that even though they claim to fight evil everywhere they go, the way that they fight amongst themselves actually indicates that they haven't done a terribly good job of fighting all of the evil, including the evil in themselves. So this is further illustrated by Lady Comet here. I think she's called Supernova in truth. And pretty soon, Rails, that's Alan Rails, is gonna explode in a bubble of guts and other things. And then Lady Comet's taking it all out on Rick. But Rick continues to insist that it's not exactly his fault that they're fighting amongst themselves, but she blames it on him. And it could really go either way, which is one reason this show is so brilliant, I think, is because it doesn't seem to take a side on what you should believe about it. It really seems to just set up a context for interpreting the ideas. And so, okay, finally, here's the final stage. What Rick is suggesting in this scene is that they find the one part of the Vindicators that Rick truly values, place it on the platform, or everyone dies. And so, in a little moment of desperation, sober Rick starts to admit that the thing they might be able to place on the platform is actually Morty, even though Morty had previously suggested that they'll probably die no matter what they put on the platform, because there isn't a single part of the Vindicators that Rick values. And so Rick makes a terribly specific guess about who could be the thing that he values most. as Million Ants on the left points out, Rick is hinting at his true love for Morty. Maybe, but like any work of metafiction, nothing at all is definitively true in Rick and Morty, because the very next frame here, Morty is pretty confident that Rick is being shy about some kind of coy love for Morty, but Rick is continuing to insist here that seriously, if anyone has a better idea, you'd better try it, because Morty, I don't like you, believe me. And so Morty goes on this little space ride, and it's like memories and shit and whatever. And there's a cute little rainbow, and Rick's crying here, and he's thanking him for sticking by him. Except then, and Morty's getting very emotional, and except by the time Morty gets back, he's not terribly pleased, and that's because Morty, watching the entire video, reveals that Rick wasn't actually talking about. In reality, he didn't make all this for Morty. It's actually for Noob, who's the Vindicator in training that had laughed at Rick's jokes. So finally, we're going to get the main thesis about good and evil here. We can't seem to get a grip at all on what Rick's values are, and well, since there's no good and evil, Lady Comet announces here, well, what's stopping me from just killing these guys, because they've caused me so much grief with my entire team being killed here, and they mistreat us, and it's all very terrible what they're doing. And so Million Ants starts to object, and they swap some love words, and as Supernova insists, it's actually faith in the Vindicators that keeps the galaxy together, which is a traditional hero perspective. That's something that you might hear from one of the Avengers. And as Rick and Morty start to start to insist that they aren't feeling terribly safe with her keeping the galaxy secure. And this scene, which is really, you could argue that Rick at least deserves what they're getting here, but Morty, I think Morty is certainly innocent, so it's hard to stay on Supernova's side here, because she's illustrating something that Alan Watts has pointed out, and we'll get to Solzhenitsyn in the next slide too, but it's not so obvious that being a superhero is so simple as finding where the evil people are and then destroying them. In reality, what Rick is trying to point out about the Vindicators, and this is the central flaw of superheroes, is that the line between good and evil is not through two groups. It's actually right through the heart of every human being. And as Solzhenitsyn puts it, who the hell is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart? Alan Watts suggested that we would terminate our race in a mutual massacre of scapegoats. And so Supernova here, for me, illustrates the classic misguided altruist, the kind that you would find in Ayn Rand's novel, for instance. She fights evil everywhere except in herself, and that's the fundamental flaw of the hero narratives that Rick and Morty is trying to illustrate here. It's the classic mistake of, I would actually say, the Marxists, for instance, that we looked at earlier in this slide. The Marxists and the Nazis, the assumption is, well, evil is somewhere else, and we just have to find the evil people and destroy them systematically. But you can't eliminate suffering by causing more suffering. People like Lenin advertised the view that if the end was noble enough, you could justify any means. But the 20th century clearly demonstrated otherwise for every sane, moral human being in the West, at least. And so Million Ants here starts to illustrate something like that to Supernova. He says that it's her values that taught him to be a man and all kinds of other cliche superhero movie stuff. But no, that's not going to work out for her. She's quite sure that she isn't willing to put up with any disagreement about what she's trying to do here, and so she continues choking Rick and Morty. But as the platform continues to raise, suddenly they find themselves on this platform in space, and it turns out that while Rick was drunk, he planned this party, and yeah. And so here's Supernova getting away, and Rick puts a cap on the discussion here by not even caring that Supernova just tried to kill them. It's just further illustrates how Rick doesn't really put any value in superheroes or villains. As he says, I end up getting high with half of the people that try to kill me. So in short, I think Vindicators uses a critique of superhero stories to suggest some more, I would say, grounded methods for combating evil in the world. What superhero movies get wrong, the show suggests, is that good and evil are external opposing forces. They're not external. That's what Solzhenitsyn pointed out. They're not external. They're actually internal, and it's not other people. It's you. That's what Marx and the Soviets, the Bolshevik communists, and the Nazis all got wrong. Seriously wrong, murderously wrong. They think that making the world a better place is as simple as finding the evil people and destroying them. That is naive. And if you meet anyone that suggests that they know who the evil people are and we just have to go get them and then we'll usher in the utopia, you should be terribly suspicious of that. Because in reality, as Supernova Woman and Rick too demonstrates, that it's right down the center of every human heart. I can't repeat that enough times. I think that's so essential, not just for analyzing literature and metafiction, but just about life, because it puts the responsibility on the individual. It means that if you don't master the resentment and the anger and the evil in yourself, then like Supernova Woman, you'll just make it worse. Because you'll try to eradicate suffering by destroying the people who you perceive as having done injustice upon you. But in reality, the response to suffering cannot be to create more suffering. And so, as is illustrated so well in Maps of Meaning, you can't master the evil in the world without first mastering the resentment and the anger and the evil in yourself. And if you try to do those in reverse order, if you try to fix the world before you fixed yourself, it looks to me that you'll just make it worse. Because as Supernova Woman demonstrates, the times that you manifest evil, you won't recognize it in yourself. You'll confuse it for virtue. And if I can make this political for a second, I think that's exactly what happened with the radical campus groups like Antifa right now. There is so much virtue and morality in the end goal that they don't see what is twisted about the way they carry it out. Violence, for instance, I don't think, no matter how opposed you are to anyone else's view, violence is never justified in a civilized, democratic Western society. But people do justify that. Because if the end justifies your means, then you're Lenin. You're above morality because it's for the greater good. It's for the greater good. And so I would say the best ending for this is, well, Rick has invited logic, and Rick remarks, well, logic is rapping about how awesome Noob Noob is, because you recall when drunk Rick called this party, it was a celebration for his friendship with Noob Noob. And right here, Rick is remarking, who the hell is Noob Noob? Of course, Noob Noob is, the one who picked up Rick's diarrhea and, their ways really stuck his neck out, as Rick even acknowledges when he was drunk and crying for laughing at his jokes in the briefing room and things like that. And so Morty is reasonably displeased here, and then credits roll. Okay, quick conclusion. So metafiction, that's a story about stories. It breaks the fourth wall, it criticizes traditional narrative tropes, and it asks whether meaning is relative to context. And it does all of that in order to guard against the harmful effects of fiction, which a lot of intellectuals blame for the tragedies of the 20th century. And one of them seems to be Foucault for me, and so I haven't quite figured out how his Marxism was reconciled with that criticism, unless I just have that totally wrong. But I'll have to look into that a bit more. I would like to find out how exactly what exactly the difference is between the postmodern theorists and the metafiction artists. Like, I would say that it doesn't seem to me that Magritte and Foucault, for instance, are really on the same ideological team, because even though both of them criticize truth as a definitive construct, I don't imagine that Magritte was much of a communist, since he was painting in the 30s, and that was right after France had been demolished in the First World War and by Germany. But then again, that wouldn't explain why Foucault would be a Marxist too, since Foucault was also from France, and he would also have a national identification with a country that had suffered considerably at the hands of communism. So, well, maybe that's just further argument for Peterson's suggestion that Foucault was just a reprehensible human being in general. I really need to keep thinking about that, to be honest. So, in conclusion, well, are there heroes and are there villains, or are there just survivors? It's worth thinking about.